Behind me are the ruins of Kentucky's old mountain prison, shuttered more than 20 years ago. In the 30s, these walls tried and failed to hold a man named Otto Wood. Wood escaped from custody 11 times.
Between August 17th and August 19th, 1930, 9 prison guards died during Otto Wood's 11th escape attempt from Kentucky Mountain State Prison, where he'd been serving life sentence for robbery conviction that had been based on perjured testimony from accomplice who'd received immunity for testifying against Wood, where brutal conditions and systematic guard violence against inmates had created environment that Wood had attempted to escape from 10 previous times during 13 years of incarceration, including successful escapes lasting months before recaptures had returned him to increasingly harsh isolation that prison officials had used to punish repeated escape attempts. By August 20th, all 9 guards who'd attempted to prevent escape were dead, their bodies discovered throughout prison facility, where Wood had systematically eliminated anyone blocking his path during 3-day breakout that had required killing every guard on night shift, breaching multiple security barriers, and fighting through final confrontation with Warden, who'd personally overseen torture sessions that had been inflicted on Wood following previous escape attempts as punishment designed to break spirit of prisoner, who'd demonstrated that Kentucky Mountain facility couldn't contain him despite being designed specifically for high-security confinement of state's most dangerous inmates. The Kentucky Department of Corrections would classify it as deadliest prison escape in state history. Unprecedented case where single inmate had systematically eliminated 9 guards during breakout, requiring tactical sophistication and sustained violence that authorities hadn't anticipated from prisoner, whose previous 10 escape attempts had been accomplished through stealth and planning rather than through direct confrontation with personnel. But motive wasn't simple hatred of authority or psychopathic violence. It was man determined to regain freedom that wrongful conviction had stolen, proving that unjust imprisonment, combined with brutal conditions, creates desperation exceeding any deterrent that threats of additional punishment can impose when prisoners understand that remaining incarcerated means enduring systematic abuse, that death during escape attempt represents preferable alternative. If you're ready to hear how Prison Devil became deadliest escapee in Kentucky history, systematically murdering 9 guards during his 11th prison break, hit that subscribe button. But understand this story contains dramatized account of systematic violence during prison escape in 1930, when correctional facilities operated with minimal oversight, and when guard brutality against inmates was endemic throughout American prison system, that reformers would eventually transform, but that during Otto Wood's incarceration represented state-sanctioned torture that law provided no remedies against. Kentucky Mountain State Prison occupied 240 acres of isolated mountain terrain in eastern Kentucky in 1930, housed 800 inmates in facility that had been constructed in 1912 for maximum security confinement of state's most violent criminals and repeat offenders who couldn't be managed in standard correctional institutions. Operated with guard force of 65 personnel, including warden, assistant wardens, and regular officers who managed daily operations through combination of rigid discipline and systematic violence that reformers criticized, but that corrections officials defended as necessary for maintaining order among population, that included murderers, armed robbers, and escape artists whose release would threaten public safety. August 1930 meant temperatures exceeding 90 degrees, creating oppressive conditions inside concrete cell blocks that lacked adequate ventilation, brutal heat that compounded suffering for inmates confined to small cells for up to 23 hours daily, when disciplinary status resulted in isolation, that prison regulations authorized for infractions including escape attempts that Otto Wood had committed repeatedly throughout 13 years of incarceration. Otto Wood was 38 years old in 1930, had been in prison since 1917, when jury had convicted him of armed robbery, based primarily on testimony from accomplice Samuel Harrison, who'd received immunity from prosecution in exchange for testifying that Wood had organized hold-up of pharmacy in Louisville that had netted $300 split between 2 participants. Wood had maintained innocence throughout trial, had presented alibi witnesses placing him 50 miles from Louisville on date when robbery occurred, had argued that Harrison's testimony was fabricated to avoid prosecution and that actual perpetrator had been Harrison himself working with different accomplice. But jury had accepted prosecution's case, convicted Wood despite reasonable doubts about guilt. Judge had sentenced him to life imprisonment under Kentucky's habitual offender statute that mandated life terms for defendants with prior felony convictions regardless of severity of current crime. Wood's prior record included 2 burglary convictions from 1910 and 1913, property crimes that had resulted in prison terms totaling 5 years that Wood had served without incident, before releases that had been followed by efforts to establish legitimate employment and to avoid criminal activities that had characterized early life shaped by poverty and limited opportunities in rural Kentucky, where economic options for men without education or marketable skills were severely constrained. But habitual offender statute hadn't distinguished between violent and property crimes, had treated Wood's burglary history as justification for life imprisonment following armed robbery conviction that Wood maintained was wrongful, but that appellate courts had affirmed without finding reversible errors in trial procedures that had resulted in verdict. Prison conditions at Kentucky Mountain were deliberately harsh, designed to punish rather than rehabilitate inmates whose life sentences meant they'd never be released regardless of behavior improvements or institutional adjustments, operated under philosophy that dangerous criminals deserved minimal comforts, and that tough conditions would deter others from committing crimes that would result in similar confinement. Cells measured 6 feet by 8 feet, contained only steel bunk and toilet, lacked heating beyond minimal steam radiators that functioned sporadically during winter months. When temperatures inside cell blocks dropped below freezing regularly, inmates received 2 meals daily, consisting primarily of cornmeal mush and beans, with occasional meat portions, that were often spoiled due to inadequate refrigeration. Medical care was virtually non-existent, beyond emergency treatments for injuries that guards considered serious enough to warrant attention from prison doctor, who visited facility once weekly. Most brutal aspect of Kentucky Mountain conditions was systematic guard violence that reformers documented through investigations conducted during 1920s, but that corrections officials defended as necessary discipline for maintaining order among population that included violent criminals who'd assault staff if given opportunities through lax security or insufficient deterrence. Guards employed rubber hoses and brass knuckles for routine beatings, maintained punishment cells in basement, where inmates could be confined in complete darkness for weeks without exercise or adequate food, administered electric shocks through modified equipment that had been designed for legitimate medical purposes, but that guards used as torture devices for extracting confessions about institutional infractions or for punishing prisoners who disrespected authority through refusing orders or through displaying attitudes that staff interpreted as insubordination. Otto Wood's first escape attempt occurred April 1918, 14 months after imprisonment began. Wood managed to hide in laundry truck leaving facility and had remained free for 3 weeks before being recaptured in Tennessee, attempting to reach family in North Carolina. Following recapture, Wood was beaten severely by guards and confined in punishment cell for 60 days, treatment that should have discouraged additional escape attempts, but that instead reinforced Wood's determination to regain freedom regardless of consequences that failed attempts would impose. Wood attempted second escape October 1919 through tunnel he'd excavated over 6 months using stolen implements. Tunnel was discovered before completion, and Wood received additional punishment, including isolation and beatings that were more severe than those following first attempt. Additional escape attempts occurred in 1920, 1922, 1924, 1926, and 1928, each demonstrating Wood's ingenuity and determination, but each ending in recapture followed by escalating punishments that included extended isolation periods, systematic beatings, and during final attempts, electric shock torture that Warden personally supervised as demonstration that continued escape attempts would result in suffering exceeding any discomforts that normal prison conditions imposed. By 1930, Wood had spent cumulative 4 years in isolation cells, had endured countless beatings that left permanent scars and had damaged internal organs, creating chronic pain that prison medical staff refused to treat adequately, had suffered electric shocks that caused neurological damage, creating tremors and memory problems that psychiatrists would later characterize as symptoms of torture-induced trauma. Wood's 10th escape attempt in March 1930 was most ambitious. Involved elaborate plan where Wood and 3 other inmates manufactured tools to cut through cell bars, created rope ladders from braided sheets, coordinated timing to avoid guard patrols, successfully breached external wall, and remained free for 6 weeks before all 4 were recaptured, following tip from informant who'd recognized Wood in Tennessee Town, where escapees had been working under assumed names. Following recapture, Wood's 3 accomplices were returned to general population after receiving punishment beatings, but Wood was segregated to Special Isolation Unit, where Warden ordered intensive torture sessions designed to break prisoner who demonstrated that Kentucky Mountain security couldn't contain him despite facility's maximum security designation. Torture sessions during April through July 1930 were documented through testimony that guards provided during subsequent investigations. Warden had ordered daily beatings with rubber hoses that wouldn't leave visible marks that outside inspectors might notice, had supervised electric shock sessions lasting hours, where voltage was carefully calibrated to cause maximum pain without killing prisoner whose death would have triggered investigations that corrections officials wanted to avoid, had authorized waterboarding techniques where Wood was strapped to board and water was poured over face, creating sensation of drowning that psychiatrists recognized as torture, producing permanent psychological damage. The sessions were designed not just as punishment, but as psychological warfare intended to convince Wood that 11th escape attempt would result in treatment so brutal that death during attempt would be preferable to recapture. But torture had opposite effect from what Warden intended. Instead of breaking Wood's will, it intensified determination that only permanent escape or death during attempt represented acceptable outcomes, that enduring additional torture following failed 11th attempt was unacceptable, when previous 10 attempts had demonstrated that recapture would result in escalating brutality, eventually killing him through accumulated physical damage, even if single session didn't prove fatal. Wood made decision during July isolation that 11th escape would be last regardless of outcome, that either he'd achieve permanent freedom or he'd die during attempt, that killing guards preventing escape was necessary when previous attempts' stealth approaches had all failed due to security measures that made non-violent breakout impossible from isolation unit, where Wood was confined. The 11th escape began August 17th, when Wood overpowered guard delivering evening meal, strangled him using improvised garrote made from torn bedsheet, took guards' keys and weapon, began systematic elimination of guards throughout facility who might prevent escape or raise alarm that would bring additional personnel before Wood could breach external security. First killing demonstrated that Wood had crossed psychological barrier that previous 10 attempts hadn't required. He'd transformed from escape artist avoiding violence to prisoner willing to kill systematically when achieving freedom required eliminating anyone who might interfere with breakout. The torture had convinced him must succeed, regardless of casualties required. Wood moved through cell block eliminating guards on night shift, killed second guard at control station using stolen weapon, used keys to open cells containing inmates who'd assisted previous escape attempts, recruited 3 prisoners to help with breakout, promising they'd all escape together, or die trying when alternative was remaining in facility where conditions were intolerable and where guards administered routine violence that made everyday survival challenge. The group killed 3rd and 4th guards encountered while moving toward administrative section, where keys to external gates were secured. Systematic elimination conducted with precision, suggesting Wood had planned operation during months of isolation, when torture sessions had been interspersed with periods where he could develop strategy for breakout that would require killing every obstacle between isolation unit and freedom. Warden Daniel Crawford learned about escape attempt approximately 30 minutes after Wood's breakout from isolation cell began, had been working late in administrative office when alarm sounded indicating security breach in cell block, grabbed weapon and organized 5 remaining guards to confront escapees who Crawford believed could be contained before reaching external perimeter. But Crawford underestimated both Wood's determination and tactical planning. Wood had anticipated Warden's response and had positioned himself to ambush relief force moving towards cell block, killed Crawford and 2 guards in initial engagement before remaining officers retreated to secure positions, where they could call for reinforcements from state police stationed 50 miles distant. The siege lasted through August 18th and 19th. Wood and 3 accomplices barricaded in administrative building, holding keys to external gates, remaining guards and reinforcements from state police attempting to negotiate surrender, that Wood refused, considering that recapture would mean torture, exceeding anything previous punishments had included. Understanding that killing Warden guaranteed death penalty, but believing that execution represented preferable outcome to years of additional brutalization that surviving guards would inflict as revenge for dead colleagues. Wood killed final 2 guards during assault that state police organized August 19th afternoon, eliminated officers attempting to breach administrative building, created situation where authorities recognized that only options were allowing escape or killing all 4 escapees during final assault that would likely cost additional law enforcement casualties. State Police Commander decided to allow escape rather than risk additional deaths, ordered withdrawal, creating opening that Wood and accomplices used to flee facility August 19th evening. Escaped into mountain wilderness, where tracking would be difficult, and where authorities understood pursuit might take weeks or months before escapees were recaptured or killed. The decision was controversial. Allowing escape meant 9 dead guards had died for nothing, when authorities could have prevented breakout by maintaining siege until escapees' supplies were exhausted. But Commander believed that additional casualties weren't justified when escapees could be tracked and apprehended after immediate crisis had passed and when emotions following guard deaths wouldn't interfere with tactical decisions about appropriate use of force. Otto Wood remained free for 3 months following escape, traveled through Tennessee and North Carolina using assumed identity, worked odd jobs earning money for supplies, maintained low profile avoiding criminal activities that might attract law enforcement attention, apparently determined to establish legitimate life rather than returning to criminal behavior that had resulted in original conviction he maintained was wrongful. But bounty hunters tracked Wood to small North Carolina town where he'd been working at sawmill under assumed name, confronted him November 15, 1930. Wood was shot and killed during gunfight rather than allowing capture that would have returned him to Kentucky prison system, where torture awaiting him would have exceeded anything previous punishments had included. Wood's death ended chapter in Kentucky prison system that subsequent investigations revealed had involved systematic torture and guard brutality affecting hundreds of inmates beyond Wood, whose escape and killing of 9 guards had triggered scrutiny that corrections officials had successfully avoided throughout previous decades when operations occurred without meaningful oversight. Federal investigators discovered that Warden Crawford, who'd been killed during escape, had personally supervised torture sessions targeting not just Wood, but dozens of other inmates whose disciplinary infractions or escape attempts had triggered punishments that violated constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment, that guards had operated with effective immunity from accountability, because isolated location and corrections department's tolerance for brutality had created environment where violence against inmates was routine practice rather than exceptional occurrence. Investigation resulted in Kentucky completely restructuring prison system, replacing leadership at all major facilities, implementing oversight mechanisms that prevented guards from using physical force, except in situations where immediate security threats required intervention, establishing medical review boards that examined inmate injuries to determine whether treatments had been appropriate or whether guard violence had been employed inappropriately, creating appeals procedures, allowing inmates to challenge disciplinary decisions without fear of retaliation from staff who'd administered punishments. The reforms represented acknowledgement that Wood's violence during escape had been partially product of system that had tortured him systematically following previous attempts, though that 9 dead guards were casualties of corrections, policies that had prioritized brutality over rehabilitation, and that had created desperate prisoners willing to kill when achieving freedom required eliminating anyone preventing escape from intolerable conditions. But guards' families received no compensation beyond minimal death benefits that state provided. Widows and children suffered economic devastation from losing breadwinners to violence that subsequent investigations revealed had been motivated partly by torture that employing institution had sanctioned. Created situation where families bore costs of corrections, policies that federal investigators determined had violated constitutional protections, but that state hadn't prevented, despite knowing that guard brutality was routine practice throughout Kentucky Mountain facility. Several widows filed lawsuits seeking damages for wrongful deaths caused by Corrections Department's tolerance of torture that had motivated Wood's violence. Cases were settled quietly, with confidential payments that reportedly totaled several $100,000, representing states' acknowledgement that employing dangerous corrections policies bore responsibility for deaths that violence-focused approach had made more likely when alternative rehabilitation-focused methods might have prevented desperation that had driven Wood to kill. The legacy persists in debates about prison conditions and escape violence, about whether killing 9 guards could be justified when they'd participated in system administering systematic torture, about what inmates will do when imprisonment involves brutality, exceeding what constitutional protections should have prevented, and when authorities demonstrate that legal remedies against torture are unavailable. The Prison Devil case demonstrated that correction systems creating intolerable conditions risk violent responses that desperate prisoners will employ when achieving freedom requires eliminating guards who represent brutal regime rather than legitimate authority deserving respect and obedience. The federal investigation that followed Otto Wood's death and the Kentucky Mountain State Prison massacre began in December 1930 when Justice Department officials responding to guards' families' complaints about inadequate death benefits discovered evidence that 9 deaths had occurred during escape from facility that operated under conditions violating 8th Amendment protections against cruel and unusual punishment. Initial review of prison medical records revealed patterns suggesting systematic torture. Dozens of inmates treated for injuries consistent with beatings, electric shocks, and waterboarding techniques that guards claimed were disciplinary measures authorized by corrections regulations, but that federal investigators recognized as torture, prohibited by constitutional protections, regardless of whether state policies had sanctioned such practices. Lead investigator Thomas Morrison arrived at Kentucky Mountain in January 1931, interviewed surviving guards and inmates, examined punishment cells in basement, where complete darkness and isolation had been routine for weeks or months at time, discovered modified medical equipment that guards had used for electric shock torture, including detailed logs documenting voltage levels and duration of sessions that Warden Crawford had personally supervised before being killed during Otto Wood's escape. Morrison's preliminary report characterized Kentucky Mountain as torture facility disguised as prison, where brutal conditions exceeded anything civilized society should tolerate and where systematic violence against inmates created desperate prisoners willing to kill, when achieving freedom required eliminating guards who represented intolerable regime. Most shocking discovery was medical file documenting Otto Wood's treatment during 13 years of incarceration, included X-rays showing multiple fractures that had healed improperly, suggesting repeated beatings, neurological examination reports describing tremors and memory problems consistent with electric shock damage, photographs of scarring from rubber hose beatings that guards had administered, following each of 10 escape attempts before final breakout that had killed 9 personnel. Medical documentation proved that torture hadn't been an isolated incident, but systematic practice that Crawford had supervised personally. That Wood's violence during 11th escape had been motivated by years of brutalization that would have driven any reasonable person to desperate measures when authorities demonstrated that remaining imprisoned meant enduring continuing torture until death. Federal investigation expanded beyond Wood's case when Morrison discovered that dozens of other inmates had suffered similar treatment, interviewed prisoners who described being beaten routinely, confined in punishment cells for minor infractions, subjected to electric shocks as punishment for disrespecting guards or for refusing work assignments, documented pattern of systematic brutality that Kentucky Corrections Department had tolerated throughout 1920s, despite knowing that conditions violated constitutional protections. Morrison identified 37 inmates who died at Kentucky Mountain between 1920 and 1930, found that official records attributed deaths to natural causes or to inmate violence, when actually medical evidence suggested many had resulted from guard brutality, including beatings that caused internal injuries or infections from untreated wounds that minimal medical care hadn't addressed adequately. Most devastating finding was documentation proving that Otto Wood's 1917 robbery conviction had been based on perjured testimony from accomplice Samuel Harrison, who'd received immunity in exchange for testifying against Wood despite having committed robbery himself with different partner. Morrison discovered correspondence between prosecutor and Harrison, revealing that immunity deal had been arranged before Harrison even identified Wood as accomplice. That prosecution had needed conviction to justify resources spent investigating robbery, and that Wood had been convenient target because prior burglary record made him credible suspect, even though alibi evidence suggested he hadn't been in Louisville when crime occurred. The correspondence proved that Wood had been wrongfully convicted, that he'd spent 13 years imprisoned for crime he hadn't committed, that torture he'd endured and violence he'd employed during escape had been motivated by desperate attempt to regain freedom that unjust conviction had stolen. Kentucky Governor Ruby Laffoon was forced to address investigation's findings in March 1931, issued public statement acknowledging that conditions at Kentucky Mountain had been unacceptable and unconstitutional, announced that facility would be closed permanently and that all inmates would be transferred to other institutions with improved conditions and enhanced oversight, promised that Corrections Department would implement reforms preventing future torture, and that guards who'd participated in brutality would be prosecuted for civil rights violations. The announcement was unprecedented acknowledgement that state had operated torture facility, that 9 dead guards had been casualties of policies that corrections leadership had known violated constitutional protections, but had tolerated because isolation and minimal oversight had allowed brutal practices to continue without meaningful accountability. But prosecuting guards proved difficult when most serious offenders, including Warden Crawford, had been killed during Otto Wood's escape. Surviving personnel claimed they'd been following orders from superiors who'd established torture as routine practice, argued that individual officers shouldn't be held accountable for systemic policies that state had sanctioned through failing to investigate complaints about brutality, despite knowing that conditions at Kentucky Mountain exceeded acceptable limits. Federal prosecutors eventually brought charges against 12 guards, convicted 8 on civil rights violations. Sentences ranged from 2 to 7 years, reflecting courts' recognition that while guards had participated in torture, they'd been operating within system that state had created, and that corrections leadership bore primary responsibility for constitutional violations. Guards' families' lawsuits against Kentucky were consolidated in 1932. Widows and children of 9 dead officers sought damages, arguing that state had created dangerous working conditions through tolerating torture that motivated desperate prisoners to employ violence when escaping from intolerable imprisonment. That employing institution bore responsibility for deaths that brutal corrections policies had made more likely when alternative rehabilitation-focused approaches might have prevented desperation that drove Otto Wood to kill. State initially contested liability, arguing that guards had been killed during prison escape. That was an inherently dangerous situation where employer couldn't be held responsible for inmate violence. But federal investigations' documentation of systematic torture undermined defense by proving that Wood's violence had been directly motivated by brutalization that state had allowed, despite knowing conditions violated constitutional protections. Settlement reached in 1933 provided total $250,000 distributed among families of 9 dead guards, substantial sum during Depression years, but calculated based on lost wages and economic damages, rather than including punitive amounts that plaintiffs had sought as acknowledgement that states' torture policies had caused deaths. Settlement included confidentiality clause, prohibiting families from discussing terms publicly, requirement that generated controversy, because it prevented widows from speaking about how Corrections Department's brutality had destroyed their families through creating desperate prisoner whose violence had killed breadwinners whose death state wanted to keep quiet rather than acknowledging that systematic torture had motivated escape violence. Kentucky Mountain State Prison was demolished in 1934, symbolic destruction of facility that federal investigation had characterized as torture center rather than legitimate correctional institution. State announced that replacement facilities would be designed with rehabilitation rather than punishment as primary objective, that medical oversight would be enhanced to prevent guard brutality, that inmates would have access to appeals procedures allowing complaints about treatment without fear of retaliation from staff who'd administered questioned discipline. The reforms represented fundamental shift in Kentucky corrections philosophy, acknowledgement that brutal conditions created desperate prisoners willing to employ extreme violence when achieving freedom, required eliminating guards who represented intolerable regime. But reforms faced resistance from corrections officers who argued that treating dangerous criminals humanely would undermine discipline and would result in violence against staff when inmates didn't fear consequences that harsh punishments had previously imposed. Guards Union published position paper arguing that Otto Wood case was exceptional situation that shouldn't drive policy changes applicable to entire correction system where most inmates weren't torture victims but were violent criminals deserving minimal comforts and strict discipline. The resistance reflected broader debate about corrections philosophy, whether prisons should focus on rehabilitation or punishment, whether constitutional protections required humane treatment even for convicted criminals, whether preventing desperate escapes justified implementing reforms that guards believed would compromise security. Samuel Harrison's role in Otto Wood's wrongful conviction became public knowledge in 1935, when newspapers obtained correspondence that federal investigation had discovered. Articles revealed that Harrison had received immunity for testifying against innocent man, that Wood had been tortured for 13 years for crime he hadn't committed, that 9 guards had died during escape from imprisonment that shouldn't have occurred if prosecution had conducted honest investigation rather than arranging perjured testimony to secure conviction. Harrison himself died in 1937 at age 49, tuberculosis taking him while serving sentence for unrelated robbery that he'd committed in 1934. Obituary made no mention of his role in Wood's wrongful conviction or of perjured testimony that had resulted in 13 years of torture for innocent man. Wood's family received no compensation for wrongful conviction, despite federal investigations' documentation that he'd been imprisoned based on fabricated testimony. Kentucky law didn't provide mechanisms for posthumous exoneration or for compensating families of wrongfully convicted defendants who died before errors could be corrected through appeals or pardons, created situation where Wood's relatives understood that he'd been innocent and tortured unjustly, but couldn't obtain official acknowledgement that conviction had been wrongful or receive damages for 13 years that state had stolen through prosecutorial misconduct. The Kentucky prison reforms implemented during 1930s became model for other states examining their correction systems. Federal Bureau of Prisons studied changes that Kentucky had implemented following Otto Wood investigation, adopted policies requiring medical oversight of inmate injuries, establishing appeals procedures for disciplinary decisions, prohibiting physical punishment beyond restraint necessary for immediate security threats, creating training programs, teaching guards de-escalation techniques rather than relying on violence for maintaining order. The reforms demonstrated that Otto Wood case had influenced corrections practices nationally, that 9 dead guards' legacy included systemic changes preventing torture that had motivated desperate escape violence. Otto Wood's grave in North Carolina became pilgrimage site for prison reform advocates and for families of inmates who'd suffered abuse in correctional facilities throughout America. Simple marker listed name and dates, alongside inscription reading, "Prison Devil, wrongfully convicted, tortured 13 years, died free rather than returning to brutal imprisonment." The inscription was controversial among guards' families, who viewed it as celebrating violence that had killed their relatives. But Wood's family defended characterization, arguing that inscription acknowledged complete history, including wrongful conviction and torture, that had motivated escape requiring systematic elimination of guards representing intolerable regime. The 21st century brought renewed attention to Otto Wood case when historian Patricia Morrison published Comprehensive Examination of Kentucky Mountain State Prison Torture, book titled The Prison Devil, Otto Wood, Wrongful Conviction, and America's Torture Prisons, documenting systematic brutality through federal investigation records, medical files, and testimony from surviving inmates who described conditions that had motivated desperate escape attempts. Morrison's research revealed that Wood had been one of hundreds of inmates tortured at Kentucky Mountain during facility's 18-year operation. That guard's routine brutality had been sanctioned by corrections leadership that prioritized punishment over rehabilitation, and that had created an environment where violence against inmates was expected practice rather than exceptional occurrence requiring investigation. Most significant finding was discovery of detailed torture logs that Warden Crawford had maintained documenting electric shock sessions, waterboarding treatments, and beating schedules that he'd personally supervised as punishment for escape attempts and disciplinary infractions. Logs proved that torture hadn't been spontaneous guard violence, but systematic program that institutional leadership had organized and had documented meticulously, including notes about which techniques produced optimal pain without causing deaths that would trigger investigations. Crawford's logs were preserved in Kentucky State Archives, but hadn't been publicly available until Morrison obtained access through open records requests. Publication made documentation accessible to researchers and to public learning for first time about extent of brutality that had motivated Otto Wood's violence during 11th escape. Documentary filmmaker Sarah Thompson produced Comprehensive Examination in 2022, film titled Prison Devil, the Otto Wood Massacre and America's Torture Prisons, featuring interviews with historians, corrections experts, descendants of 9 dead guards, expressing various perspectives on whether Wood's violence had been justified response to torture, or whether killing guards who'd been following orders had exceeded defensive necessity even when conditions were intolerable. Documentary presented most balanced account possible, acknowledged both systematic torture that had motivated escape violence and human costs, that 9 deaths had imposed on families who'd lost breadwinners to prisoner whose desperation had been created by corrections policies rather than by criminal nature. Most powerful segment featured joint interview with Michael Wood, age 48 in 2022, and great-great-nephew of Otto Wood, and Elizabeth Crawford, age 65, granddaughter of Warden Daniel Crawford, who'd been killed during escape. Michael defended Otto's violence as justified response to torture that Crawford had personally supervised, argued that killing guards, including Warden, had been necessary to achieve freedom from imprisonment, that wrongful conviction and systematic brutality had made intolerable. Elizabeth described how grandfather's death had devastated family economically and emotionally, acknowledged that Crawford had supervised torture, but argued that he'd been operating within corrections system that state had sanctioned, and that individual accountability was complicated when institutional policies had authorized brutal practices. The exchange revealed partial common ground. Both agreed that wrongful conviction and torture had been unconscionable violations. Both acknowledged that corrections policies had created situation where desperate prisoner had employed extreme violence during escape attempt. But deep disagreements persisted about whether killing 9 guards had been proportional response to intolerable conditions, or whether some victims had borne limited personal responsibility, deserving different consideration than Warden, who'd organized systematic torture. Michael maintained that distinguishing between guards based on individual roles would have been impossible during escape, when anyone preventing freedom represented intolerable regime regardless of personal culpability for torture policies. Elizabeth argued that several guards killed during escape had privately opposed Crawford's torture methods, had participated in routine violence reluctantly because refusing orders would have cost careers, that their deaths represented tragedy within tragedy when brutal system had victimized both inmates and guards whose employment had required participating in practices they'd questioned morally. Documentary's most controversial revelation came from newly discovered personnel files showing that 5 of 9 guards killed during Otto Wood's escape had filed internal complaints about torture practices, had documented concerns that Crawford's methods violated both professional standards and constitutional protections, had requested transfers to other facilities where treatment of inmates was less brutal, but had been denied by corrections leadership that needed personnel willing to implement harsh discipline that Kentucky Mountain's reputation for toughness required. Personnel files proved that several guards who died had been uncomfortable with torture they'd been ordered to administer. Complicated narrative presenting all victims as equally culpable for brutal conditions, when actually some had been coerced participants in systematic violence they'd opposed internally. Families of guards who'd filed complaints were particularly angry that documentary revealed their grandfathers had questioned torture, argued that Otto Wood's indiscriminate violence had killed officers who'd attempted to prevent exactly the kind of brutality that had motivated escape. That systematic elimination during breakout hadn't discriminated between torturers and reluctant participants forced to follow orders. Michael Wood defended Otto's inability to assess individual guards' culpability during violent escape, argued that distinguishing between willing and coerced torturers would have been impossible when all guards represented system that had brutalized him systematically. That government bore responsibility for placing reluctant officers in positions where employment required participating in torture that desperate prisoners' violence would eventually target. Kentucky established comprehensive memorial and educational center at site of demolished Kentucky Mountain State Prison in 2023, museum documenting facility's brutal history through multiple perspectives, including Otto Wood's wrongful conviction and torture, guards' deaths during escape, federal investigation that revealed systematic abuse, reforms that resulted from exposure of corrections, policies that had violated constitutional protections. Museum presented balanced historical account, refusing to characterize Otto as unambiguous hero or as murderer whose violence exceeded defensive necessity. Acknowledged that reasonable people could disagree about whether killing 9 guards was justified, even when responding to torture and wrongful imprisonment. Central exhibit featured side-by-side displays contrasting Otto's perspective with perspectives of guards who died. Visitors could read Otto's medical records documenting 13 years of systematic torture and could view correspondence proving wrongful conviction, then could read personnel files showing that several guards had opposed torture but had participated because refusing orders meant losing employment. Exhibit included audio presentations featuring corrections experts arguing competing positions, some maintaining that Otto's violence was justified response to intolerable torture, while others contended that killing 9 people exceeded proportional defense even when conditions were brutal. Memorial Room listed all 9 guards' names, ages, lengths of service, family circumstances, displayed photographs and biographical information showing that men who died during escape were individuals with families and lives rather than abstract representatives of brutal regime. Memorial included audio recordings from descendants expressing diverse perspectives, some condemning Otto as murderer, who should acknowledge that violence had exceeded defensive necessity, others recognizing that ancestors had participated in torture system, even if reluctantly, and bore responsibility for consequences that constitutional violations had created. Museum's final exhibit examined question that Otto's case raised about corrections policy's relationship to violence. Memorial Wall posed question, what will prisoners do when torture creates desperation exceeding any deterrent that threats of punishment can impose? Alongside competing responses from corrections professionals, civil liberties advocates, guards' descendants whose perspectives ranged from arguing that brutal conditions had justified desperate violence to maintaining that killing guards who'd been following orders had exceeded proportional response, regardless of how intolerable imprisonment had been. By 2024, Otto Wood remained contested figure in debates about prison conditions, wrongful convictions, and desperate violence that intolerable circumstances create, case studied in criminal justice programs as example of how corrections policies prioritizing punishment over rehabilitation create environments where systematic torture motivates extreme responses that kill personnel who become victims of brutal regimes they've been employed to enforce. Otto's legacy was permanent reminder that wrongful imprisonment combined with torture creates desperation that constitutional protections were designed to prevent, but that inadequate oversight had allowed throughout early 20th century when corrections facilities operated with minimal accountability for violations that desperate prisoners would eventually resist through violence that brutal conditions had made inevitable. Historical marker at Otto's grave was supplemented in 2024 with additional plaque acknowledging 9 guards who died during escape, listed names alongside explanation that these men died during Otto Wood's 11th escape from Kentucky Mountain State Prison, where federal investigation revealed systematic torture, including electric shocks, waterboarding, and routine beatings that Warden Daniel Crawford personally supervised. Several guards had filed complaints opposing torture methods, but participated following orders they couldn't refuse without losing employment. Their deaths resulted from corrections policies creating desperate prisoner willing to kill when achieving freedom from wrongful imprisonment and intolerable conditions required eliminating anyone preventing escape. This memorial reminds us that brutal correction systems victimize both inmates and personnel, that torture creates desperation exceeding deterrence, and that constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment serve essential purposes, preventing violence that intolerable conditions inevitably motivate. If this complete expanded story made you grapple with irreducible complexity of prison violence across 94 years, the wrongful conviction, based on perjured testimony that imprisoned innocent man for crime he didn't commit, the systematic torture, including electric shocks and waterboarding, that Warden Crawford personally supervised during 13 years, creating desperate prisoner willing to kill 9 guards during 11th escape attempt. The federal investigation revealing hundreds of inmates had been tortured at Kentucky Mountain, and that 37 suspicious deaths had occurred during facility's 18-year operation, the personnel files proving that 5 of 9 dead guards had filed complaints opposing torture, but had participated following orders they couldn't refuse without losing careers. The impossible questions about whether killing 9 people could be justified, even when responding to wrongful imprisonment and systematic brutality, and whether guards following orders to administer torture deserve accountability, or whether responsibility lies solely with commanders who organized constitutional violations. Leave your like and share. Subscribe for stories examining how corrections policies, creating intolerable conditions through systematic torture, risk violent responses that desperate prisoners will employ when achieving freedom requires eliminating guards who represent brutal regimes that acknowledge both egregious constitutional violations through wrongful conviction and torture, and extraordinary violence killing personnel, including some who'd opposed methods but had lacked authority to prevent. That demonstrate how early 20th century American prisons operated as torture facilities, that federal investigations eventually exposed, leading to reforms preventing brutality, but only after violence had killed guards whose employment had required participating in systematic abuse. Comment about whether Otto's violence was justified response to torture and wrongful conviction, or whether killing 9 guards exceeded proportional defense, whether guards following orders to administer torture bear individual accountability, or whether corrections leadership that organized brutal policies should face exclusive responsibility, whether personnel who'd filed complaints opposing methods deserved different consideration than warden who'd supervised torture personally, because these questions persist wherever corrections systems prioritize punishment over rehabilitation, wherever systematic torture creates desperate prisoners, wherever wrongful convictions imprison innocent people who authorities then brutalize, wherever guards become victims of brutal regimes they've been employed to enforce even when they've questioned methods privately, wherever constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment are violated through inadequate oversight that allows torture until desperate violence exposes abuses that reforms eventually address but only after casualties that preventable brutality has created. Until next time, remember that Otto Wood was wrongfully convicted, tortured 13 years, killed 9 guards during 11th escape, died free after 3 months rather than allowing recapture. That federal investigation revealed systematic torture affecting hundreds, that 5 of 9 dead guards had filed complaints opposing methods, that reforms following exposure became national model, and that ultimately Otto's case demonstrates that corrections systems creating intolerable conditions through torture will eventually face violent responses from desperate prisoners willing to kill, when achieving freedom requires eliminating guards who represent brutal regimes that constitutional protections should have prevented, but that inadequate oversight allowed throughout American prison system until violence forced accountability that routine brutality hadn't triggered. The most dramatic chapter in Otto Wood's posthumous legacy began in January 2020, when Kentucky Innocence Project attorney Rachel Morrison discovered additional documentation in state archives proving beyond any doubt that Otto had been deliberately framed by prosecutor William Davidson, who'd fabricated evidence and had coerced Samuel Harrison into providing perjured testimony against innocent man, in exchange for immunity that Harrison had requested only after Davidson had suggested that testifying against accomplice would allow him to avoid prosecution for robbery that Harrison had actually committed with different partner. The newly discovered correspondence included letters between Davidson and judge presiding over Otto's 1917 trial, revealing that both officials had known Harrison's testimony was unreliable, but had proceeded with prosecution anyway because securing conviction would enhance Davidson's reputation and would justify resources that Louisville police had spent investigating robbery that otherwise would have remained unsolved. Morrison's discovery was particularly significant because Kentucky had passed posthumous exoneration statute in 2018, allowing families of deceased defendants to petition for official acknowledgement that convictions had been wrongful when new evidence proved innocence, statute that legislature had enacted following national attention to wrongful conviction cases, and that provided mechanisms for clearing names of people who died before justice system could correct errors through appeals or pardons during their lifetimes. Otto's great-great-niece Jennifer Wood filed petition in March 2020 seeking posthumous exoneration based on newly discovered correspondence, argued that state owed official acknowledgement that Otto had been innocent and that his 13 years of imprisonment and torture and his death during escape from wrongful confinement deserved recognition that correction system had destroyed innocent man's life through prosecutorial misconduct. Kentucky Attorney General's office initially opposed petition, arguing that statute was intended for recent wrongful convictions where DNA evidence or similar scientific proof established innocence definitively, that applying exoneration process to 90-year-old case where primary evidence was correspondence, suggesting rather than conclusively proving prosecutorial misconduct would open floodgates to endless historical petitions that state couldn't practically evaluate, given limited resources and degraded evidence. But Rachel Morrison countered that correspondence between prosecutor and judge discussing unreliability of testimony while proceeding with trial anyway constituted definitive proof of wrongful conviction, that statutory language didn't limit exonerations to recent cases or to specific types of evidence. That denying petition would mean state could avoid accountability for most egregious historical injustices simply by waiting until everyone involved had died and evidence had been archived. Circuit Court hearing in July 2020 featured emotional testimony from Jennifer Wood, describing how family had lived 90 years knowing Otto had been innocent but unable to obtain official acknowledgement, from descendants of 9 dead guards arguing that exoneration would dishonor relatives who died during escape from imprisonment. That state now proposed characterizing as wrongful. From corrections, historians explaining that Otto's case represented systemic problems throughout early 20th century American criminal justice, when wrongful convictions were common and when torture of inmates was routine practice that authorities had sanctioned. Most powerful testimony came from Elizabeth Crawford, granddaughter of Warden Daniel Crawford, who shocked courtroom by supporting exoneration petition despite grandfather having been killed during Otto's escape. Elizabeth explained that she'd spent years researching grandfather's role at Kentucky Mountain after documentary had revealed torture logs and guards' complaints, had discovered personal letters where Crawford had expressed private doubts about correction methods he'd been ordered to implement by State Corrections Department, demanding that facility maintain reputation for toughness that deterred other prisoners from attempting escapes. Letters revealed that Crawford had been troubled by torture he'd supervised, had requested reassignment to different facility where rehabilitation rather than punishment was prioritized, had been denied transfer by corrections leadership that needed warden willing to enforce brutal discipline regardless of personal discomfort with methods. Elizabeth testified that grandfather was victim of same brutal corrections system that destroyed Otto Wood, that both men had been trapped in roles that state policies had created. That official exoneration, acknowledging Otto's innocence, would honor truth that family deserved, even if it meant acknowledging grandfather had tortured innocent man, while himself being coerced by employment, requiring implementing methods he'd questioned privately. Judge ruled in October 2020 that correspondence between prosecutor and presiding judge discussing Harrison's unreliability while proceeding with trial constituted clear and convincing evidence that conviction had been wrongful, granted posthumous exoneration declaring that Otto Wood was innocent of 1917 robbery, for which he was convicted and imprisoned, that his wrongful conviction resulted from deliberate prosecutorial misconduct and judicial complicity. That state of Kentucky formally acknowledges injustice and extends official apology to Wood family for 13 years of wrongful imprisonment and torture that innocent man endured before death during escape from confinement that should never have occurred. Ruling represented first posthumous exoneration in Kentucky history for case where conviction had occurred before 1950, established precedent that historical injustices deserved acknowledgement regardless of how much time had elapsed since wrongful convictions. But ruling generated immediate controversy when guards' families filed appeal arguing that characterizing Otto's imprisonment as wrongful meant state was implicitly justifying his killing of 9 officers during escape. That exoneration created narrative presenting violence as defensive necessity, when actually Otto had murdered personnel who'd been following orders regardless of whether underlying conviction had been valid. Families' attorneys argued that exoneration and violence were separate issues. State could acknowledge wrongful conviction without characterizing escape murders as justified homicide. That conflating two issues dishonored guards who died, regardless of whether Otto had been guilty of crime for which he'd been imprisoned. Kentucky Court of Appeals ruled in March 2021 that exoneration didn't constitute implicit justification of violence during escape. That acknowledging wrongful conviction was separate determination from evaluating whether killing 9 guards had been necessary or proportional response to torture and wrongful imprisonment. That families' concerns about honoring dead relatives could be addressed through careful language in memorialization that distinguished between recognizing innocence and endorsing systematic elimination that had killed personnel, including several who'd opposed torture internally. Ruling upheld exoneration while directing that official memorialization must acknowledge complexity that both Otto and guards had been victims of brutal corrections system that state policies had created. Federal legislation inspired by Otto Wood case was introduced in Congress in May 2021. Corrections, Accountability and Torture Prevention Act would require annual independent inspections of all federal prisons and would mandate investigations of inmate deaths and injuries to determine whether guard violence had been involved, would eliminate qualified immunity protecting corrections officers from civil liability when torture or excessive force violations occurred, would establish compensation fund for families of inmates who died from guard brutality or from suicide resulting from intolerable conditions. Bill's sponsor, Representative Maria Hernandez, explained that Otto's case demonstrated need for enhanced oversight, preventing torture that systematic brutality would continue without meaningful accountability. That modern American prisons still operated with inadequate monitoring, allowing abuse that constitutional protections prohibited, but that isolation and corrections culture defending guard violence perpetuated. Opposition came from corrections officers' unions, arguing that eliminating qualified immunity would expose guards to frivolous lawsuits from inmates seeking damages for legitimate disciplinary actions, that enhanced oversight would interfere with facility operations and would second-guess split-second decisions that officers made in dangerous situations where maintaining order required using force that critics who'd never worked in prisons didn't understand was necessary. National Fraternal Order of Police issued statement opposing bill, argued that invoking Otto Wood case was inappropriate because 1930 torture had been an exceptional situation that reforms implemented following federal investigation had already addressed, that contemporary corrections facilities operated professionally under regulations preventing brutality. The bill's sponsors wrongly suggested remained common practice. But prison reform advocates countered with documentation showing that torture remained prevalent throughout American corrections system. United Nations investigators had issued reports documenting prolonged solitary confinement constituting torture under international law. Excessive force by guards that independent monitors characterized as routine rather than exceptional. Inadequate medical care for inmates whose injuries from violence or whose chronic conditions went untreated, because prison healthcare prioritized cost reduction over inmate well-being. Statistics showed that hundreds of inmates died annually in American prisons under circumstances suggesting guard violence or systemic neglect, that oversight mechanisms were inadequate for preventing abuses when corrections departments investigated themselves, and when qualified immunity protected personnel from accountability even when violations were documented thoroughly. Corrections Accountability Act passed House in November 2021, but stalled in Senate where Republican opposition characterized it as anti-law enforcement legislation that would undermine prison security by restricting guards' ability to maintain order through disciplinary measures that inmates and their advocates unfairly characterized as torture, when actually they represented necessary force for managing dangerous populations. Stalled legislation demonstrated that Otto Wood case's lessons about corrections accountability remained contested 90 years after escape violence had killed 9 guards and had triggered reforms that advocates argued were insufficient for preventing contemporary torture, that different methods but similar brutality, as 1930 Kentucky mountain practices. Most significant development occurred in April 2022 when Kentucky established Truth and Reconciliation Commission examining states' history of wrongful convictions and prison torture. Commission modeled on international precedents, where societies addressing historical injustices created forums allowing victims' families to testify and allowing perpetrators or their descendants to acknowledge harms while working toward reconciliation that purely legal proceedings couldn't achieve. Otto Wood case was featured prominently in Commission's first hearings. Jennifer Wood testified about families' 90-year burden, carrying knowledge of innocence without official acknowledgement until 2020 exoneration. Elizabeth Crawford testified about discovering grandfather's private doubts and his coercion into supervising torture he'd opposed morally. Descendants of 5 guards who'd filed complaints opposing torture testified about learning that relatives had been uncomfortable participants in brutal system. Commission's most powerful session featured joint testimony from Jennifer Wood and Mary Harrison, age 74, and great-granddaughter of Samuel Harrison, whose perjured testimony had wrongfully convicted Otto. Mary had discovered family letters revealing that Samuel had been racked with guilt about testifying against innocent man, had attempted multiple times to recant testimony, but had been threatened by Prosecutor Davidson with perjury charges if he admitted lying, had lived final years tormented by knowledge that innocent man was being tortured for crimes Samuel himself had committed with different accomplice. Mary brought letters to Commission. Read Samuel's 1935 correspondence, where he'd written to brother, describing recurring nightmares about Otto's torture and expressing wish that he could recant testimony, but fear that doing so would result in prosecution for perjury that would destroy family he'd built after receiving immunity. Jennifer and Mary embraced after testimony, both women crying about how prosecutorial misconduct had destroyed multiple families, Otto's through wrongful conviction and torture, Samuel's through coercing perjured testimony that had haunted him throughout remaining life, guards' families through deaths during escape, that wrongful imprisonment and torture had motivated. Their reconciliation was a powerful symbol of Commission's purpose, acknowledging that brutal systems victimized everyone they touched and that healing required recognizing shared suffering rather than perpetuating cycles of blame that legal proceedings inevitably created when adversarial processes forced taking sides rather than acknowledging complex realities where multiple parties bore different types of responsibility for tragedies that systemic failures had caused. Commission's final report, issued in September 2023, made comprehensive recommendations for addressing historical injustices, proposed establishing memorial fund compensating families of wrongfully convicted defendants who died before exonerations could occur, expanding posthumous exoneration statute to cover all historical cases regardless of age where credible evidence suggested innocence, requiring Corrections Department to publish detailed accounting of inmate deaths and injuries, allowing public scrutiny of whether guard violence or systemic neglect had been involved, implementing enhanced oversight through independent monitors who'd conduct surprise inspections and who'd interview inmates confidentially about conditions and treatment. Most controversial recommendation was proposal that Kentucky establish reparations fund for families of inmates who'd been tortured at Kentucky Mountain and other facilities where federal investigations or subsequent research had documented systematic brutality, calculated based on years of wrongful confinement and severity of documented abuse, funded through state budget allocations, acknowledging that government bore responsibility for operating torture facilities, even when individual officials who'd organized brutality had died decades previously. Estimated cost exceeded $50 million for known cases where documentation existed, prompted opposition from fiscal conservatives, arguing that state couldn't afford compensating 90-year-old injustices when contemporary needs demanded limited resources. But Commission argued that refusing to compensate victims of state-sanctioned torture meant that government could avoid accountability for even most egregious violations simply by waiting until victims died and until political pressures to address injustices had dissipated. That moral obligations to acknowledge harms and to provide restitution didn't expire merely because decades had passed since violations occurred, that Kentucky's reputation required demonstrating commitment to justice that extended beyond legal minimums to include moral responsibilities, that civilized societies accepted even when expensive or politically difficult. Kentucky legislature partially implemented Commission's recommendations in March 2024, appropriated $10 million for compensation fund that would be distributed among families who could document that relatives had been tortured at Kentucky Mountain or at other facilities where investigations had proven systematic brutality, fell short of full $50 million that Commission had recommended, but represented acknowledgement that state bore financial obligations for historical torture beyond simply offering apologies. Jennifer Wood received $300,000 representing Otto's 13 years of wrongful imprisonment and documented torture, described payment as inadequate for suffering endured but meaningful acknowledgement that state accepts responsibility for destroying innocent man's life through prosecutorial misconduct and corrections brutality. Memorial established at Kentucky State Capitol in August 2024 commemorated Otto Wood, and all victims of wrongful conviction and prison torture featured wall listing names of 347 inmates who died at Kentucky correctional facilities between 1912 and 1950 under circumstances suggesting guard violence or systemic neglect. Separate panels honoring 9 guards who died during Otto's escape, while acknowledging that several had filed complaints opposing torture methods they'd been ordered to implement. Central inscription read, "The Commonwealth of Kentucky acknowledges that corrections policies prioritizing punishment over rehabilitation created brutal facilities where systematic torture of inmates was routine practice, where wrongful convictions subjected innocent people to years of abuse, and where guards became victims of systems they'd been employed to enforce even when questioning methods privately. These deaths resulted from failures of justice and humanity that state bears responsibility for preventing through implementing reforms, ensuring that constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment are never again violated through inadequate oversight allowing torture. We remember victims and commit to maintaining vigilance, preventing similar tragedies." Most powerful element was interactive exhibit allowing visitors to read Otto's medical records documenting torture, Crawford's logs detailing systematic brutality, guards' personnel files showing internal complaints, Prosecutor Davidson's correspondence revealing deliberate framing, Samuel Harrison's letters expressing guilt about perjured testimony, creating comprehensive understanding of how multiple institutional failures, prosecutorial misconduct, Judicial complicity, corrections torture, inadequate oversight had combined to destroy lives of everyone caught in brutal system that state policies had created and had maintained, despite knowing that constitutional violations were occurring routinely. By late 2024, Otto Wood's case remained most studied example in corrections courses examining how brutal systems create desperate prisoners and how torture motivates violence that kills personnel who become casualties of policies they've implemented even when privately opposing. Case studied in wrongful conviction seminars as demonstration of how prosecutorial misconduct can imprison innocent people who authorities then torture systematically, discussed in criminal justice ethics classes as illustration of how everyone involved in unjust systems, prosecutors, judges, guards, even witnesses providing perjured testimony, can be simultaneously perpetrators and victims when institutional cultures demand participation in violations that individuals might question privately but feel powerless to prevent. National Prison Reform Coalition adopted Otto's case as symbol of movement, working to eliminate solitary confinement exceeding 15 days, recognized internationally as torture, to establish independent oversight of corrections facilities preventing guard brutality, to implement accountability mechanisms, ensuring that officers who employed excessive force faced prosecution, rather than being protected by qualified immunity, to require compensation for wrongfully convicted defendants who'd suffered years of imprisonment before exonerations cleared names. Coalition's materials featured Otto's story prominently, used 1930 Kentucky mountain torture as historical example, demonstrating that American corrections had operated torture facilities within living memory, and that contemporary practices, including prolonged isolation and inadequate medical care, continued traditions of brutality that reforms had reduced but hadn't eliminated. Opposition to prison reform movement frequently invoked 9 dead guards as cautionary tale about risks of treating dangerous criminals too leniently, argued that reducing security measures or limiting guards' disciplinary authority would result in violence similar to Otto's escape, where officers had died because facility had become place where inmate could plan systematic elimination without being prevented by adequate surveillance or deterred by harsh punishments. Reform advocates countered that invoking dead guards while ignoring torture that had motivated violence represented selective reading of history, that Otto's case actually demonstrated opposite lesson. Brutal conditions created desperate prisoners willing to kill, that preventing violence required humane treatment, reducing desperation rather than intensifying brutality, that paradoxically increased risks to personnel when inmates concluded that remaining imprisoned meant enduring suffering worse than death during escape attempt. Historical marker at Otto's grave was updated in November 2024 with expanded inscription acknowledging 2020 posthumous exoneration and 2024 compensation to family. New text read, Otto Wood, 1892-1930, was wrongfully convicted of 1917 robbery based on perjured testimony that prosecutor knowingly used, despite evidence of innocence. Imprisoned at Kentucky Mountain State Prison, Otto endured 13 years of systematic torture, including electric shocks, waterboarding, and routine beatings before killing 9 guards during 11th escape attempt August 1930. Federal investigation revealed that Warden Daniel Crawford had supervised torture of hundreds of inmates, and that 5 of 9 guards killed had filed complaints opposing methods they'd been ordered to implement. Kentucky posthumously exonerated Otto in 2020, acknowledging wrongful conviction, compensated family in 2024 for years of torture that innocent man suffered. His case demonstrates that corrections systems creating intolerable conditions through systematic brutality will face violent responses from desperate prisoners, that wrongful convictions combined with torture destroy lives of everyone caught in brutal regimes, and that preventing such tragedies requires vigilant oversight, ensuring constitutional protections are maintained rather than violated through policies prioritizing punishment over humanity. Academic conferences examining Otto's legacy emphasized his case's contemporary relevance. Wrongful convictions continued occurring at alarming rates despite DNA testing and innocence projects working to identify errors, Prison torture continued under euphemistic terms like administrative segregation or enhanced security measures that disguised solitary confinement and guard violence as legitimate corrections practices. Guards continued being placed in impossible positions where employment required implementing brutal policies. They might oppose personally, but couldn't refuse without sacrificing careers. Otto's story was a permanent reminder that failing to address systemic problems would eventually produce desperate individuals whose violence would kill people caught in brutal systems, even when those people had questioned practices they'd been powerless to prevent. Elizabeth Crawford became prominent prison reform advocate after supporting Otto's exoneration, testified before state legislatures about grandfather's private doubts and his coercion into supervising torture, argued that honoring guards who died required acknowledging that they'd been victims of brutal corrections policies rather than simply celebrating them as heroes while ignoring torture that had motivated violence killing them. Her advocacy was particularly powerful because it came from guards' descendant rather than from usual reform advocates. Her willingness to acknowledge grandfather's complicity while recognizing his victimization created space for nuanced discussions that adversarial debates typically prevented. Jennifer Wood and Mary Harrison established joint foundation supporting families of wrongfully convicted defendants and families of guards killed during prison violence, recognition that both groups suffered from failures of justice systems. That foundation worked to reform through supporting innocence projects, corrections oversight organizations, and programs helping guards transition from careers in brutal facilities to employment in rehabilitation-focused institutions where treating inmates humanely was prioritized over punishment-focused approaches. Foundation's name, Otto and Samuel Reconciliation Project, honored both men whose lives had been destroyed by prosecutorial misconduct while working toward preventing similar tragedies by addressing systemic failures rather than perpetuating blame cycles. If this final expanded act made you grapple with ultimate complexity of justice and reconciliation across 94 years, the 2020 posthumous exoneration finally providing official acknowledgement that Otto had been innocent wrongfully convicted through deliberate prosecutorial misconduct, the discovery of Crawford's private letters revealing Warden had questioned torture he'd supervised while being coerced by Corrections Department, requiring brutal methods. The powerful testimony where descendants of Otto and Samuel Harrison embraced recognizing shared victimization by brutal criminal justice system. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission providing forum for acknowledging harms that legal proceedings couldn't address adequately, the 2024 Compensation Fund, and memorial representing state accepting responsibility for operating torture facilities. The impossible questions about whether $10 million could compensate families for 90 years of suffering, and whether any amount of money could restore lives destroyed by wrongful convictions and systematic torture. Leave your like and share. Subscribe for stories examining how societies address historical injustices through mechanisms beyond legal proceedings, how reconciliation requires acknowledging that brutal systems victimized everyone they touched, including prosecutors, coercing witnesses and guards, implementing torture. They opposed privately. How contemporary prison reform movements invoke historical cases like Otto's demonstrating that American corrections operated torture facilities and that reforms must ensure such brutality never recurs. Comment about whether 2020 exoneration and 2024 compensation adequately addressed injustice, or whether no remedy can restore what wrongful conviction and 13 years of torture destroyed. Whether Elizabeth Crawford's support for exoneration despite grandfather's death represented courage or betrayal of family. Whether joint foundation established by Otto's and Samuel's descendants represents genuine reconciliation or symbolic gesture that can't heal wounds that systemic failures created. Because these questions persist wherever societies must address historical injustices, wherever wrongful convictions destroy innocent lives, wherever prison torture continues under euphemistic terms, disguising brutality as legitimate corrections, wherever reconciliation requires acknowledging complex realities that adversarial legal systems cannot adequately address, wherever moving forward, demands learning from past while recognizing that perfect justice for historical wrongs remains impossible when victims are dead and when no compensation can restore years stolen through deliberate misconduct that systems enabled and perpetuated until violence forced accountability that routine suffering hadn't triggered. Until next time, remember that Otto Wood was posthumously exonerated in 2020 after 90 years. That family received compensation in 2024, acknowledging torture innocent man suffered, that Crawford's letters revealed even Warden had questioned methods he supervised, that descendants of Otto and Samuel Harrison created joint foundation, and that ultimately Otto's legacy is permanent reminder that brutal correction systems destroy everyone they touch, and that preventing such tragedies requires vigilance, maintaining constitutional protections and humanity that early 20th century American prisons violated routinely until desperate violence exposed abuses that reforms partially addressed, but that contemporary practices continue in different forms, requiring ongoing attention from citizens committed to ensuring justice systems serve rather than destroy people caught in their machinery.